Hi, I'm Sahaana, and welcome back to a series I like to call Easily Confused and Perpetually Frazzled. In our last video, I explored some basic questions about tenant rights in Ontario, but what happens after you get an eviction notice?
One of the main misconceptions that people have about evictions is that the eviction notice that they get is when they have to move out. So the eviction notice is just really the first step of an eviction process. And people have more rights than I think they realize they do. So the termination date on the eviction notices, that is not the date that you have to move out by. That is the date where the next step of the process will occur.
That's Lily Xia from the Federation of Metro Tenants Association, also known as the FMTA. FMTA is a nonprofit organization that helps tenants advocate for better rights. They actually have a tenant hotline where you can ask specific questions about tenant rights. While they can't offer you any legal advice, they can tell you what the law says. If you asked me when I began this process if I could find the commonality between bread making and evictions, I probably would have laughed in your face. But it turns out they're both heavily reliant on process, except one process is legally binding and potentially life-altering, and the other produces delicious mouth-watering carbs. Rosalia Thompson, a litigation lawyer at the Advocacy Centre of Tenants Ontario, explains that eviction notices are letting you know that the landlord is initiating the first step of the legal process.
Your notice of termination will say the reason why your landlord believes you should be evicted. It will give you some information about your rights, and then it will also have something called the termination date. And the termination date is the date on which your landlord is requiring you to leave. So let's say the termination date is like December 31st. If you don't leave by December 31st, then depending on what type of eviction notice it is, within the time frame after the termination date, your landlord can file an application at the Landlord and Tenant Board to evict you. Your landlord will file their application based on that notice of termination, and then the Landlord and Tenant Board will set a hearing date. And on that date, you can marshal your evidence, you can get legal advice, and you can, try to defend yourself or bring evidence to show that the basis for your eviction is incorrect. And then the Landlord and Tenant Board decides.
If we were to break it up into basic terms, evictions have four main steps. Phase 1 occurs when the landlord gives you an official written notice for a valid and specific reason. As we know now, this does not mean you need to leave as soon as possible. Landlords must use the Landlord-Tenant Board, also known as the LTB, forms to start the legal process. Phase 2 is the eviction application. A landlord may file an L form with the LTB. An L form is an application to the LTB to get an order to evict a tenant or end a tenancy. Even if your landlord submits this form, this does not mean you need to move out. You will get a notice of a hearing either in the mail or by email. Phase 3 is the hearing. This is where you go in front of the Landlord-Tenant Board to dispute your landlord's eviction application. Finally is Phase 4. If the application is successful, then the LTB will submit an eviction order, and you will need to move out by the date listed on that order. If you don't leave on the date provided, then the landlord will need to file an order to the Court Enforcement Office, whose sheriffs are the only people allowed to enforce the LTB's eviction order and make you move out.
One of the more common mistakes I notice is people really just relying on the Landlord and Tenant Board to prevent evictions. But the Landlord-Tenant Board is not that friendly to tenants. If you can do stuff outside of the Landlord-Tenant Board, say talk to your neighbors, figure out more stuff of what's going on, try to collect maybe more evidence, and maybe try to pressure your landlord outside of the Landlord-Tenant Board to drop the eviction notices, those do have a bigger impact, I think, on preventing eviction than just relying on the Landlord-Tenant Board. Don't get me wrong, definitely go to your eviction hearing, but there are other things that you can do to prevent your eviction that's not through the Landlord-Tenant Board.
As usual, I'm going to link all of the resources I've been reading in the bio in a document called The Non-Extensive Guide to Evictions. Let's recap. Eviction notices can only be given for valid and specific reasons as outlined in the RTA. Eviction notices are the first step in the legal process. And 3, if I get an eviction notice, I should probably seek legal advice. That should be enough, right? I should be done. We can all go home. Wrong. I just found a bunch of forms. I have no idea what they're saying. So I'll see you back here